Hello and welcome to another round of MTGA Tasting Notes. We are getting into the newest release of our Single Barrel Merlot. Many of you know this as the pinnacle in our wine program. I know Cabernet has its place and it's always the big guns, but many of you know that we are a Merlot producer through and through. That's how we started. That's what we continue to do today as our flagship. And it's something that I really try to capture in the best light possible every single season. Now, this is 2022. We're talking about 9 years ago. In 2013, we started this Single Barrel program. And it's hard for me generally to pick out a favorite wine to make year in, year out, because they all kind of have their own quirks and characteristics about them. But if I was going to pick one, the Single Barrel Merlot is it. Because it's the tippy top, it's our Mount Everest, it's the whatever you want to call it. It is the best of the best that we can put forward every single year. And really trying to hammer home Merlot in particular and make the best Merlot that we can, and some of the best, hopefully, that Napa has to offer. This is how we do it. It's really to dial in this particular lot that is just singing. To put it quite frankly, it's just the yummiest out of the bunch from that particular year. And this 2019 release was no exception. Now, 2019, it was kind of a great year. And I think everyone that I talk to, any friends or colleagues, anyone in the winemaking world, are incredibly excited for these 2019s because they are just so good out of the gate. There's really not a whole lot of quirkiness about them. Our 2018 vintage, for example, the year prior had a little bit more structure. It needed a little more time to open up. And some of those wines are still our current releases, which is, we're just waiting for them to continue down that path. The 19s really have a leg up in the sense that you can just pop these bottles and get after it. Our 2018s, I say hey, if you wanted to camp these wines, give them a little airtime, or if you're looking for a particular vintage to lay down and hang on to, go for it. 19, feel free to jump into these bad boys whenever you want. That's not to say that they aren't going to get better with a little extra time, but man, they are just sexy right out the gate, which is just almost any 19 that I've tried. It's just wow, these are just on a different level. It was almost like going from 2011 to 2012. 11 being that really wet, rainy year. Those wines were very structured, very dense, and they needed more time. Then you get to 2012, which is big, luscious, and easy drinking. It's a lot like that. It's just ready to rock and roll. Now, as for those of you that aren't necessarily familiar with our Single Barrel program, it is something that we started really to highlight a particular variety in just the best way possible. So every January, we get through harvest and into the winter season for the following year, and I go through all of our barrels and I taste through them. Very, very tough part of the job, as you might imagine. And I just kind of earmark some things that are just, frankly, more complex, more complete, and just honestly, if I could bottle them even in just a few short months, I probably could. Knowing full well that if we put them into some new oak barrels, let them age for upwards of 2 full years, they're only going to get better with that time. So that's really what I try and earmark for our Single Barrel program, whether that's the Merlot, we do make that Single Barrel Pinot Noir, and we started making that Cabernet Franc as well. All of those kind of follow that same mentality, okay, what is just tasting, quote unquote, the best from that particular vintage, and we try and run with it the best way possible. Now, traditionally with this Merlot, we do use anywhere from about 90 to 100% new oak on this wine, just to make that best one barrel that we can. And there are times where that new barrel really absorbs into that wine. It can get a little too woody, so we'll use some free run juice and still bottle only about 60 gallons of it total. And there are other times where that one barrel just clicks on all cylinders, and that happens, luckily enough, more often than not. And that was the case in 2019. This was kind of a set it and forget it. It was still a lot of work, don't get me wrong, but because of just how great the 2019 vintage was shaping up, there were wines that didn't necessarily, for us anyway, need a lot of hand holding. You still need to make sure that we get them where they need to go, of course, but they didn't need a lot of tweaking or tinkering when it came time for bottling. They were pretty much lined up to knock it down. It was one of those great years where I definitely felt I was more of a guiding hand in the winemaking process and just making sure that these wines are going from grape to bottle as efficiently and as yummy as they possibly can be. Where you have years like 2020 with a bunch of fires rolling through the area where you're like, okay, you really have to be hands-on and kind of push and shove things a little bit more. And it's a bit more stressful. You could say the same thing about a really wet year like 2011. You really kind of have to work at it a little more. There's a little bit extra stress involved with some of those years. Anyway, when we bottled this up, this would have been in September, early September 2021. So it's spent just under 2 full years in 100% new oak. All French oak as well, I should imagine. And that's something that you pick up right off the nose. And it's very typical of these single barrel wines, is it has these really nice kind of coffee, mocha, toasted oak. It does have a touch of almost like that. This is where I'm gonna get really geeky for a minute, but I was just in Kansas City, and if you have like those like just solid barbecue, like kind of smokiness, like it's got that savoriness and that sweetness from the wood that's being used, like that's what we're talking about on this guy. Like it just has this really beautiful aroma to it. And that's the reason why it is, you know, the pinnacle of our program, is it literally just jumps out of the glass at you. And the beautiful thing about how it jumps out of the glass, it's this really intense aroma. And when you taste it, very typical of Merlot, it's like, oh, this is just smooth, it's sexy, and it's got that big flavor. There's some really great structure behind it. Very typical of our wines. I tried to keep the acidity a little higher, so it has this nice, almost like refreshing quality to it, despite how big it smells and even looks with the dark color that it has. It's more red fruit driven. There's a little bit of like your blackberries and maybe plum in there, something that's a little bit more tart, of course, rather than going towards like fig or something of that nature that's a little riper, maybe a little juicier, a little jammier. We definitely play on kind of the lighter, brighter end of that spectrum, which is where I really love to keep Merlot. But that barrel really helps flesh that out and give that a little bit more weight and a little bit more body, and you get a little bit more of those like licorice and, you know, baking spice kind of characteristics from that barrel aging side of things. I apologize, like I wax very poetically about this wine because it is just, it's such a joy to make, and to see the difference in this compared to say our Napa Valley Merlot, which is kind of our staple everyday Merlot that we make, and this being more of the, you know, reserve bottling, so to speak. It's, you know, these grapes are harvested on the same day, processed the same way. They all go into neutral barrels after fermentation. They sit in those neutral barrels until January, and that's when I start making my decisions of kind of what barrels are going to go where. And you find that barrel that's just, you'll have 8 or 10 barrels of Merlot, and even though they were processed all at the same time, fermented and made in essence the same way, all of a sudden, you know, just a few short months later, you have 10 different wines in front of you. And at that point, I get to be a kid in the candy shop and say, okay, this one is singing. We're going to put this baby in a corner and let it do its thing. And that's really the beginning of how we separate this wine from the herd and allow it to just become something really special in our program. It's something that I'm so happy that we're able to continue to do. And this 2019 is just, it is clicking on all cylinders. And probably my favorite thing about it though, is that it's that big, intense red wine, but it's so easy to drink. This is a wine that you could easily, after a long day, put your feet up on the couch, pour yourself a nice country club pour to the brim and just kick back and relax. Or it's that wine that you can, there's enough complexity, enough body and structure in there as well that you can pair this with food. You can, you know, put it into a blind tasting, or, you know, have a bunch of people try and kind of see what they think and really geek out and pick this wine apart. There's a lot going on in there, but at the same time, it's very crushable, which is frankly, for big red wines, I think that's something that can be very hard to achieve, because sometimes those big flavors can kind of get in the way of that. It's something that you're like, oh shoot, I need to have food with this one. Oh shoot, you know, this has to pair with that, or man, this needs more time. And it's something that I really try and do with our single barrel program, and this Merlot in particular, is say, hey, we're gonna make that really big red wine, but we want this to be able to, if you wanna lay it down, great, more power to you. If you wanna wait 5 years and see where it's at, more power to you. If you're gonna wait 5 minutes until dinner starts cooking and then pop that bottle open, then how about it? You can really get after it. So this is definitely one of the more complex wines, but also, as a result, one of the most versatile wines in our lineup. So if you haven't had a chance to snag this 2019 release, we do have a little bit of it left after our winter wine club shipment. So do get in touch if you need to check it out and give it a try. Or of course, if you're heading out to the winery and Napa, we can always see you out here and go through the lineup personally as well. So as always, thank you so much for tuning in. Feel free to give us a shout with any questions, comments. Be sure to hit follow on our YouTube channel if you haven't just yet. We're going to try and kick out a lot more tasting notes, newsletters, and content throughout the year, so it'll be great to keep in touch. Cheers.